This is the last in a series of 3 that we've been privileged to talk about that I pray in some small way has brought an honor to the God we're privileged to serve. I'm convinced that God has left us an amazing testimony in the world of which we're privileged to be a part. And so the theme this week has been this: origins. Is it reasonable to believe in God in this scientific age? I've tried to make the point to you repeatedly. Lots of folks in our age will tell you no, it is unreasonable to believe in God anymore. In fact, Ben sent me a video clip today of a man who was interviewing lots of different people and asking them, "Are you an atheist?" And they just excitedly said yes. Lots of folks will tell you that today. They don't believe God and don't believe there's any necessity in it. They think that's a foolish notion. And I'm here to try to explain to you why I am absolutely convinced that God exists and that He's left a grand testimony of Himself in the natural world. The song that you just sang a while ago, which was a request, but he'd already picked out that song because it's a good one. Our God, He is Alive, was written by A.W. Dicus in 1966. I was at school at Florida College in 1963 to 65. And A.W. Dicus was the dean of our college. So I knew him personally. He was a physicist and widely respected as a scientist and a deep believer in God. And I'm convinced he wrote this song at that particular time because of something that was happening in our country. Some of you are old enough to remember there was the God is Dead movement in this country. It didn't start in the 1960s, but it certainly blossomed in our country during that time. In fact, Time magazine on April the 8th, 1966 had this headline: "Is God Dead?" It's an interesting idea to think that God is dead. And in that article, the several articles in that magazine, Altizer and Hamilton were quoted from their book Radical Theology and the Death of God, and here's what they said: "We must realize that the death of God is an historical event, that God has died in our cosmos, in our history." In other words, God was around, but now He's dead. And by the way, these are both preachers, Altizer and Hamilton. The dead God is the God of the historic Christian church and beyond the church of Christendom at large. So the God who died is the God taught by Christianity, according to them. They are both preachers in a, quote, Christian church of some kind. Pretty amazing, isn't it? The 1960s. And of course, the position that people took was that we made up God in the first place so we could then kill Him also. And one of the things that killed Him was science, which has led us to understand how things work without needing God. So Brother A.W. Dicus wrote a song that says, "Our God, He is alive." I hope you sang it with vigor. "In Him we live and we survive." And I hope you believe it with all your heart. So is it reasonable to believe in God in this scientific age? Let's look at Psalm chapter 8 as a beginning place tonight. And I repeat for the third time, when I do this kind of a lecture in a church building, I like to start with the Bible, because the Bible itself supports the very idea of what we're doing tonight as we look at the natural world. So Psalm 8 says, "O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth, you who set your glory above the heavens." And verse 3 says, "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you visit him?" So the psalmist declares that the heavens speak of the glory of God. And they certainly do. And so in Romans 1, our theme passage for this week, The passage teaches that since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So it's the argument, ladies and gentlemen, from design to which we turn again this evening. Now, it's my intent tonight to talk to you about the macroscopic world. Macro means big. So we're going to talk about the universe tonight and talk about some of the ways in which it also testifies to design, which is always and forever the strongest argument from the natural world for the existence of God. Well, you see the subtitle? The Rare Earth. That's going to be my theme tonight, and you'll see why in just a moment. This picture I have before you is one of the most famous pictures ever taken. So I'm going to read you about it in a book that I'm going to recommend to you called The Privileged Planet by Guillermo Gonzalez and Jay Richards. And I'm reading to you from the first introduction of this book. On Christmas Eve, 1968. Raise your hand if you were alive then. Oh, thank you. You remember what you were doing on Christmas Eve, 1968? Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders became the first human beings to see the far side of the moon. The moment was as historic as it was perilous. They had been wrested from Earth's gravity and hurled into space by the massive, barely tested Saturn V rocket. Although one of their primary tasks was to take pictures of the moon in search of future landing sites, and by the way, the first lunar landing took place just 7 months later, many associate their mission with a different photograph, commonly called Earthrise. Emerging from the moon's far side during their fourth orbit, the astronauts were suddenly transfixed by their vision of Earth, a delicate, gleaming swirl of blue and white, contrasting with the monochromatic, barren lunar horizon. This is the moon, folks. Whoops, excuse me, I was doing the wrong thing there. That's the moon's surface. And that's Earthrise. Earth had never appeared so small in human eyes, and yet it was never more the center of attention. To mark the event's significance and its occurrence on Christmas Eve, the crew had decided, after much deliberation, to read the following. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The reading and the reverent silence that follows went out over a live telecast to an estimated 1 billion viewers, the largest single audience in television history. You think that would be allowed today in 2019? Not at all. A lot of things have changed since 1968, and not necessarily for the better. I want to tell you a little sidelight. If you were to come to my office, you would see that picture on my wall. The fact is, I own the original print of the Earthrise. And the reason I own it is because a member of the church where I was preaching back in the 1960s and 70s actually developed the film for that picture. And the original print, which was sent to Cape Canaveral, was rejected because they said the earth was not blue enough. And so they sent it back for him to redo it. And this lady asked to have that copy to keep personally. 40 years later, I was holding a meeting and using this picture. and she was in the audience. And she said, I have something for you. And she brought it to me the next night, wrapped in a cloth. It was already deteriorating. Folks, that's one of the most precious things I own. It's behind vacuum-packed glass that's non-glare glass and mounted in my office with a notarized note on the back of how I got it. It's one of the most famous pictures ever taken. And a lot's been done with this. I don't know if you're aware, but there were 3 men in that spaceship: Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders. Frank Borman and James Lovell became stronger believers in God after this experience. William Anders became a stronger atheist. Anders' reaction to this was, I don't see any evidence of God out here. And look at that little lonely planet in the midst of this nothingness. Some Russian cosmonauts have felt the same way. And it illustrates that the same evidence can sometimes lead folks in completely different directions. They saw the same thing. Their reaction was quite different. That's a famous picture. But here's another one. This is the path of the Voyager 1 spacecraft, which also left our planet some years ago. And let me read the Voyager left our Earth in 1988. And in 1990, it took a picture some 4 billion miles away from Earth. I want to show you that picture. Is there a way we can dim the lights? Is that the best we can do? Thank you. If we could get more lights out. And we'll need to do this again, by the way, in a little bit. Now, you're not allowed to fall asleep, class. And I'm not going to leave them out or I'll lose you in a hurry. But I want you to see a little better the image that I'm going to show you. That's a picture of, what do you think? That's a picture of Earth from 4 billion miles away. And there's a book written about it called The Pale Blue Dot by our famous author Carl Sagan. So let me point it out here. You see that little dot right there? This arrow is not in the picture, class. That was added later. And this beam that you see here is an error of optics. But I want you to just look at that picture for a few minutes. And now if I could have some light so I can read, and you will stay awake. I want to read you what Carl Sagan said about this. Listen closely. Because of the reflection of sunlight, Earth seems to be sitting in a beam of light as if there were some special significance to this small world. But it's just an accident of geometry and optics. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged place in the universe are challenged by this point of pale blue light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic darkness. In all of our obscurity, in all of this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. Are you sufficiently depressed? Sagan's view, and the view of many others, is this kind of evidence shows us how little and insignificant and unimportant we are in the vastness of space, and do you seriously think there's some God that cares about that little pale blue dot? Absolutely not, they would say. And I can tell you that since the days of Copernicus in the Middle Ages, when man came to understand that the earth does not sit at the center of the universe with everything revolving around it, that in fact it appears from the evidence of the natural world we're but one planet revolving around another large object called our sun, and that's but a part of a large galaxy which is but a small part of a massive universe. And while mankind used to have the notion that the earth sat still, not moving, and God's attention was focused on this, that surely is not the case, would say many. And so while we lost our place at the center of the universe, in many instances, and in the part of many philosophers, we also lost God with it. And the notions I've read to you about this evening, they said support that. So what about you? In this little book I mentioned to you last night, Intelligent Life in the Universe, by Carl Sagan and I.S. Shklovsky, they refer to man's first efforts to try to figure out how many places there might be in the universe where there's somebody else living, maybe more intelligent than we are. And one of the first efforts at that was Frank Drake's equation. You see it up there on the screen. It was an effort to try to figure out how many there might be of communicating civilizations in our Milky Way galaxy. And so I'm not going to take the time to explain all the details to you. You can get the book and read about it. But you can see several factors up here. The number of stars in the galaxy is n sub s. That's this one. The fraction of stars suitable for life is that one. Well, how do you know that? Well, there's about 0.05 to 0.3, they say. And the fraction of suitable stars with planets, about 0.1. The average number of habitable planets or moons per solar system, the fraction on which life develops, the fraction on which intelligence develops, the fraction of which try to communicate, and the fraction of stars' life during which communication civilization lasts. Folks, that's the biggest bunch of guesses. And they ended up with all those guesses of figuring that was somewhere between 0.000000005 and 750,000 civilizations somewhere in our galaxy. Well, I will tell you, in the 1960s, when I was in college and Carl Sagan was a college professor, he wasn't my professor, he was at Purdue, I was at Harvard. But he and his compatriots were telling us the numbers way up here, more like this number. In our one galaxy, there could be as many as 100,000 different civilizations. Yeah, that was the common perception in those days. And you know why? Because the notion was developing that evolution of life from non-life was evidently going to happen relatively easily. It was a heady time, ladies and gentlemen, as in 1953 they discovered the structure of DNA, and we began to understand life at the biochemical level better than anybody ever had. And the thought was, it won't be a short time till we figure out how life came about and how it happened without God. And it probably, if it happened here, probably happened lots of other places. That was the common conception. You remember the third verse of the song you just sang? Brother Dicus' song? Secure is life from mortal mind. God holds the germ within his hand. Though men may search, they cannot find, for God alone does understand. May I say something to you? Our biology professor at my college in those days refused to sing that verse, because he truly thought it would be a very short time that we figured out how life happens and how to make it, and that it doesn't need God. I will tell you, I'm privileged that I have lived 50 more years since then. And may I tell you that the experts on how life came from non-life are more confused and disturbed than ever, because they've learned in the last 50 years it's so much more complex than they ever dreamed. The thought that they had back then, we'll figure all this out in short order, has gone kaflooey. We don't have a clue how life came about from non-life. And it's far less probable in the scientist's mind than it was then. So don't be ashamed to sing verse 3. It's just fine. But Francis Drake and those others of his thought they could figure out maybe how many civilizations there are nearby where there's intelligent life. And then we come along some 50 years later with a book by Peter Ward and Donald Brownlee, thoroughgoing evolutionists. Don't misunderstand me. These folks believe life evolved. But they have to admit that the earth on which we live, based on all the evidence been collected, is pretty rare. In fact, they argue in this book that complex life is uncommon in the universe. Complex like life like us. And for that to have been said in the 1960s would have been considered heresy in the scientific community. Now there are lots of people saying it, because the more we've learned, the more likely it is that there's probably not another place in the universe like ours. Isn't that interesting? Another book I'd recommend to you is the one I've already said, The Privileged Planet, by Guillermo Gonzalez and Jay Richards. And their thesis is this: how our place in the universe is designed for discovery. The very same properties that allow us to exist also provide the best overall setting to make discoveries about the world we live in. And they argue that may be looked upon as a coincidence, but it sure looks like a design to them. And may I tell you that Professor Gonzalez, an astronomer at Iowa State University, never got tenure after this was published. And many of the faculty members at his school rose up in holy horror because he dared to suggest that the universe might be designed. I'll recommend that book to you. It's fascinating. But there's a third one I think is even better reading for the average person who doesn't study astronomy. It's called God's Crime Scene by J. Warner Wallace. You need to get this book. J. Warner Wallace was raised by parents who were atheists, and they still are. He's become a believer and is based heavily on the evidence of the natural world. And J. Warner Wallace is a cold case detective. You know what that is? What's a cold case detective, man?
They hold unsolved cases and solve them.
That's exactly right. And so here's what he says: a cold case detective examines the evidence for a divinely created universe. And so each chapter in his book is built around a crime scene and a crime investigation. It's fascinating. So let me read you a little bit here. This is not bedtime reading. Everybody stay with me. It has a point to be made. Helen knew something was wrong when her daughter Carrie failed to answer the door. It was a bright summer afternoon. Carrie said she'd be home, and her car was indeed parked in the driveway. Helen tried to peek in through the living room window, but the curtains were unusually drawn. Carrie never locked the back door, but when Helen walked into the backyard of the old home, she found a door locked and all the windows closed. This was not like Carrie. She usually left one badly worn rear window slightly ajar. Helen began to panic. She knew Todd and Carrie had a tumultuous marriage, one that included physical violence. Todd had moved out, but Helen still feared for her daughter's safety. The couple had a child named Lexi, but the violence had only intensified since her birth. A week ago, Todd had threatened to kill Carrie. And just last night, Carrie confided to Helen that there'd been yet another fight. When Helen couldn't get Carrie to answer the door on that afternoon, she decided to call the police. Our officers responded and met Helen on Carrie's front porch. After getting approval from their sergeant, they forced their way into the home, and approaching the rear of the house, the officers began to smell gas. It was the strongest at the base of the stairwell leading up to the second floor bedroom. So they called the fire department hazmat team. And I'm not going to read you the rest of this chapter's introduction about this murder case, but they found Carrie and Lexi dead on the second floor. And the question was this a natural occurrence? Were they just asphyxiated by the gas by some natural reason? Or did somebody tamper with this? Was there outside interference? And they set about to solve the case. And of course, our cold case detective got involved. Well, he says in this book that you have to look for three kinds of evidence: foundational, regional, and locational. And in this particular case, there was evidence in all those areas that pointed to interference. There was tampering here. This didn't happen by natural causes. And I'll not give you all the details, but I can assure you that by the time this case went to court, Todd was convicted of first-degree murder based on the composition of the evidence. Now, here's what he says in the next section. We were compelled to examine evidence of tampering because of one important fact. There were 2 dead bodies at the crime scene. In a similar way, when we look at this nature of our universe, the existence of living bodies should promote investigation. Why do we have living bodies in this universe? What brought that all about? Did it come by natural causes? Or has somebody tampered with this? That's the question. The delicate requirement for the existence of galaxies, star systems, and planets capable of supporting intelligent observers is incredibly fragile. And when you look at the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, it adds up to a powerful case for tampering. And that's what he does in the next few pages. So I want to share some of that with you tonight. And you're going to be the jury, okay? And as a jury, you need to pay close attention. My first line of reasoning, ladies and gentlemen, is to ask you to pay attention to Goldilocks. So, kids, I need help. You remember the Goldilocks story? Tell me about Goldilocks. Yeah, you. What did she do? She went out.
She was looking for a house.
Out in the woods, right? And did she find one?
Yes, she wanted something to eat.
She was a little hungry.
And she was tired.
And she was kind of tired. So she went in the house, and what did she find?
They both
3 bowls of porridge. And she tried the first one and it was too hot. She tried the second one, it was too cold. And then she found the third one and it was just right. And so she ate it all up. And we're not going to go on, you know the story. But each case, something was too hot or too hard or too soft or whatever, and then she found one that was just right. So this book titled The Goldilocks Enigma is asking the question, why is the universe just right for life? This is by Paul Davies, an evolutionist, not a creationist. But he's asking the question, why is the universe just right? Well, what does he mean by that? One of the most significant facts, arguably the most significant fact about the universe, is that we're a part of it. That's what Wallace is saying here. There are living things here, aren't there? Look around you. How'd they get here? That's amazing. That's a lot more significant than the 2 dead bodies in the crime scene. How'd the live bodies get here? And what's the best explanation? Well, it sure looks like the universe is just right for living things. Everyone agrees the universe looks as if it was designed for life. Here's another quote from Universes by J. Leslie, another evolutionist. You can tell by what he says. It looks as if the universe is spectacularly fine-tuned for life. By this I mean only that it looks as if small changes in the universe's basic features would have made life's evolution impossible. So here's what we say. There are lots of factors, ladies and gentlemen. If you change them 1 teensy bit, you would have no life. And everybody knows it. Nobody argues with this. Even the unbelievers don't argue with this. It's called the anthropic principle. Anthropos is the Greek word for humankind. In the 1960s, when I was in school, kids, they had discovered 2 characteristics of the cosmos that seemed to be fine-tuned to make life possible. And 8 to 10 characteristics of our solar system. By the 2000s, they had discovered 38 characteristics in the cosmos and over 150 characteristics in our solar system. All seem to be fine-tuned to support life here on Earth. Now, my question to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is how many instances do you have to have to convince you that somebody tampered with this? 188, is that enough? All different factors that played together to make life possible? And if you change any of those a small amount, you'd have no life? Does that make you begin to think somebody tampered with this? This didn't happen by natural causes. So what are some of those? Well, let's look at foundational first. Back in that court case about Todd and Carrie, the foundational stuff was the background. He was physically violent to his wife and they had a terrible relationship. Doesn't that affect how you might interpret the evidence? The background? Well, of course it does. Well, what about in universe? Ladies and gentlemen, you see what I have on the screen? We're not going to talk about all those, but the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, the gravitational force, the ratio of electrons to protons, and the mass density of the universe. I'm sure you know a lot about all of those. Here's what I want to tell you about every one of them. Every one of them is in a very narrow range of possibility to support life. You change any one of those a teensy bit and you won't have life. So let me go back to his book here just a minute. The ratio of electrons to protons must be precariously balanced. The value of this ratio, if it deviates more than 1 in 10 to the 37th, you would have no life. That's just one of those factors. Now, you can't grasp 1 in 10 to the 37th. 10 to the 37th is 10 with 37 zeros. So can I give you some idea of how big that is? He gives this illustration. Imagine covering the entire North American continent in dimes and stacking them until they reach the moon. Now imagine stacking just that many dimes again on another 1 billion continents of the same size as North America. If you marked one of those dimes and hid it in the billions of piles of dimes you've assembled, the odds of a blindfolded friend picking out the correct dime is approximately 1 in 10 to the 37th. The same level of precision required for the ratio of protons to electrons. I'm telling you. So, class, even the atheists don't argue with these figures. You can't change these numbers that are on the screen before you by very much at all, or you won't have life. You won't have the universe. Now let's talk about regional factors. We're down now to our own galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy. Well, you have to have the right kind of galaxy first to have a solar system like ours. You can't just have any old galaxy. It has to be a proper type of galaxy. And we've learned a whole lot more about galaxies from the Hubble telescope. And here's where I need the lights off again, would you? I want to show you a picture from Hubble. Thank you for your service, gentlemen. You can't see the stars very well in Greenville. That's one portion of the constellation Serpens through the Hubble telescope. You see all those stars? What you don't know, ladies and gentlemen, is see these big ones here like this? All of those are not stars. Those are galaxies that contain billions of stars inside of them. And that's just one small piece of the universe which we've been able to photograph through Hubble telescope. Okay, you can turn the lights back on now. Now I want to read you from another little book I'd like to recommend called The Source by John Clayton. Here's some more facts. 80 out of every 100 galaxies are classified as elliptical. You see the one up here? Unlike spiral galaxies, elliptical galaxies are made up of older stars, contain very little dust and only limited amounts of other solid material. There's nothing in an elliptical galaxy from which to produce a planet, let alone life. 80 out of every 100 galaxies are eliminated as a source of life in the universe because they couldn't support a system like ours. There are irregular galaxies. They certainly couldn't support a life system like ours. There are Seyfert galaxies that explode every few years. That doesn't work too well. The kinds of galaxies that support a system like our solar system are spirals. Isn't that beautiful? But that's a relatively small number of galaxies in the universe, ladies and gentlemen. Most galaxies would not support life, and everybody knows it. But that's not enough. Not only do you have to have the right kind of galaxy, you have to have the right place in the galaxy. So let's look at our galaxy side on. There's the Milky Way galaxy. It has a big old bulb in the middle. If you're going to have a planetary system like our sun, it's got to be either right there or right out there in one small donut, right out here or right out here. Most of the stars in our galaxy could not support a planetary system, and everybody knows it. So that means only a small piece of even the galaxies that do have the possibility can support life. Now, you do understand that we ought to spend an hour on each one of these points? But I'm not going to bore you with that. Then you have to have the right kind of star. Our sun, ladies and gentlemen, looks pretty big to us. But it's a pretty average sized star. Let me show you some pictures here. This is a relative picture. If that's our sun, here's Jupiter, and here's Neptune, and there's Earth, relative to the size of our sun. What you probably don't know is our sun, relative to some other objects like Sirius, the dog star, and Pollux and Arcturus, is a relatively small star. And where's Earth? You can't even find it. But that's not all. There's Arcturus, Rigel, Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, and Antares. Can you find the sun up there? It's right there. You can't even see it. So, our sun is approximately a mid-sized star. And it supports a planetary system. Most of the stars in the universe, of which there are billions, are eliminated. They're either too big or they're too little. And the sun is, say it, just right. The Goldilocks enigma. But that's not all. You have to have the proper mass of your planet. You think any old planet will do to support life? No, folks. Most planets that exist are out because they're either too big or too little. Only a very few are just right. So in our planetary system, what about Jupiter? You think you could have life on Jupiter? Is anybody looking for life on Jupiter? No, folks. Jupiter is so massive, the forces on that planet would tear everything up. Same with Saturn and Neptune and Uranus. Look, Earth, and what are the others close to the size of the Earth? Mars. This is Mars, and this is Venus. Venus is almost the same size as the Earth. Why don't we look for life on Venus? Anybody know? Nope. It's in the habitable zone. You see, every sun has a habitable zone, but it's a very limited region. The Earth and Venus are in the habitable zone, so is Mars. Why aren't we looking for life on Venus? I'll tell you, its atmosphere is 90-some odd % sulfuric acid. Not real good for life. And plus, there's a lot of other reasons. So you got Earth and you got Mars. Are we looking for life on Mars? Yes, we are. Because it's the only other hope we've got in our planetary system. We'll get back to that in a minute. Not just any planet will do, ladies and gentlemen. It's got to be the right mass. Secondly, it has to have the right tilt. Did you know that? Our Earth tilts at 23.5 degrees. You ought to go home and thank God for 23.5 degrees. The tilt of our Earth in its rotation around the sun is what gives us what, class? The seasons and the dispersion of heat. If that weren't the case, you couldn't have life on this planet. Well, if we did, it didn't last very long. Yeah, but how long? One day. I'm talking in general here, sir. You have to have the right tilt. Did you know how important the moon is for life? Well, that's a day's worth of discussion. And by the way, there's a whole chapter in some of these books about that. Read about it. You have to have the right atmospheric conditions. Very important. You have to have the right terrestrial crust. And 140 more. All of which cannot vary within very much of a limit. They have to be, say it with me, just right. Now class, As of now, we know of 38 characteristics like that in the cosmos that are foundational. We know of over 150 of those in our solar system that are regional and locational. And all of them have to be just right. It looks to me like somebody tampered with that. That didn't happen by natural causes. It looks to me like that was planned. And then there's water. If you were in my chemistry class, you would learn to love water. It's the most researched substance to this day on the face of the earth. And it's the most common substance with such properties that you cannot hardly believe. It's unique everywhere you look. I like to tell my class, so I'm going to tell you too. Here's water. If you look at, for example, specific heat, how much heat does it change the temperature of the water? How much heat does it take? A lot. You want to have a constant temperature where you live? Come to my place. St. Pete, Florida. Tampa, Florida. We're surrounded by water. The temperature is always between about 60 and 90. Almost never changes. Now it does sometimes, but hardly ever. You know why that is? Because if you look at every other common substance on earth, here are their specific heats, and boom, there's water. There are other properties where everybody's like this, and then boom, there's water. It's lower than anybody else. It's unique. So let me talk to you just a little bit about water. I'd love to go on and on about this. And I know I already have the reputation to do that anyway, but water, it covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface. On Mars, they're having trouble finding evidence of any. They're saying, oh, it looks like there might have been some. Did you know you can't have life without water? Period. Life as we know it on Earth is absolutely dependent on carbon and water and several other things, but carbon and water are the big ones. And water has so many unique properties, it's incredible. Most plants and animals contain more than 60% water by volume. So when your brother calls you waterhead, he's right. And you can call it back to him too. It has a unique structure. Everybody knows water is H2O. That means 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen in that ratio. But what you probably don't know is that the angle between the bonds in water is 104.5 degrees. That's another one of those factors that is just right. And it gives water its unique properties. It has a negative end and a positive end. That's called a polar molecule. And because of that, it has lots of wonderful properties. It's the only substance on Earth that exists naturally in all 3 states, solid, liquid, and gas. It has a uniquely high specific heat. Its wide temperature range is a liquid from 0 to 100 degrees centigrade. Folks, if you didn't have liquid water most of the time, down in my state, we hardly ever have solid water except in iced tea. You have it more up here, and you go farther north and south, you get lots of it. But mostly it's liquid. And the reason that's so critical is because liquid water helps regulate the temperature of everything. Did you know your blood is mostly water? It regulates your temperature. Doesn't change that much because of water. Looks like a plan to me. Water is less dense as a solid. That's not supposed to happen. When something goes from liquid to solid, it's supposed to condense and solidify, right? Water, when it becomes solid, gets bigger. Why do you think the ice in your tea glass is at the top? Because liquid water is more dense than solid water. Folks, that's unusual. And if it weren't the case, there would be no life on Earth. Period. You say, why? Go look it up. It's a universal solvent, and it has high surface tension and cohesion and adhesion. I'll just give you one example. Did you know you can take a capillary, stick it down in water, and the water rises in it without you doing anything? That's because of cohesion and adhesion. Water will rise up a tree through its capillaries up to 50 feet by itself. Everywhere we look, ladies and gentlemen, from the macroscopic to the microscopic, everything looks like it's made. It had a designer. As Michael Behe says in his well-respected book, Darwin's Black Box, a loud, clear, piercing cry of design. And by the way, he did put it in all caps with exclamation points, so it's okay for me to scream. Because everywhere you look, you see design. If you were Richard Dawkins in the face of all of that, you would look at it and say, it may look like that, but it wasn't designed. All that's required is the blind forces of physics acted upon by natural selection, and you can create anything. All you got to do is break it down into small steps, and each step is certainly possible, and you add up all those small steps and you get something amazingly that looks designed, but it isn't. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen in the jury, how many coincidences does it take to convince you that was designed? That didn't happen by natural causes. I hope I've given you enough tonight to say that reasonable belief in God, it's more reasonable than ever in this scientific age. And I will tell you, folks who miss it in our age are going to have some answer for more than ever, in this man's humble opinion. And that's our lesson for tonight.